On November 2, 2016, in the town of Redding, California, an event occurred that shocked not only the local community but the entire country. Sherri Papini, a 34-year-old mother of two, a wife and resident of a quiet suburb, disappeared during her routine morning jog. This day began like any other in the Papini family. Keith, Sherri's husband, went to work, and their children, 4-year-old son Tyler and 2-year-old daughter Violet, were at daycare. Sherri, as usual, decided to go for a run around her Mountain Gate neighborhood. The Papini family led an ordinary middle-class American life. Sherri and Keith met in school but only married in 2009 after rekindling their relationship. According to friends and relatives, they were the perfect couple, attractive, active, loving parents who dedicated their lives to raising their children. Sherri, a former delivery service and AT&T employee, had devoted herself to homemaking, while Keith worked at Best Buy. They lived in a small, cozy house surrounded by pine trees in a quiet area of Northern California. When Keith Papini returned home after work, he discovered that his wife was not home, and the children were still at daycare, where Sherri was supposed to pick them up. Concerned about his wife's unusual behavior, he immediately activated the iPhone tracking app and found that Sherri's phone was on the side of Sunlight Way, near their house, just a mile from where she usually ran. At the location where the phone was found, Keith also discovered Sherri's headphones with tangled hair on them. This heightened his concern, and he immediately contacted the Shasta County Sheriff's Office. Within a few hours, a large-scale search operation was launched, involving local law enforcement, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, search and rescue teams with dogs and helicopters. The disappearance of a young mother of two immediately attracted the attention of local and national media. Sherri Papini's story quickly spread across social media. The community rallied around the Papini family. Dozens of volunteers combed forests, fields, and roads near Redding. Sheila Kester, Sherri's sister, actively participated in the search, giving emotional interviews and coordinating volunteer efforts. Keith Papini appeared on television, pleading for information that could lead to finding his wife. Sherri's parents, Loretta and Richard Grafe, were also involved. They moved closer to their daughter's home to help with the children and support their son-in-law. According to Loretta, her daughter was a devoted mother who would never voluntarily leave her children. "This is not like her, to just disappear. She lives for her children," she said in an interview. With each passing day, anxieties grew. Sherri's family offered a $50,000 reward for information about her whereabouts, which was soon increased to $100,000 by an anonymous donor. At that time, theories about what might have happened to the young woman ranged from an accident to abduction and possible murder. While the search continued, investigators considered several possibilities, from voluntary disappearance to kidnapping. However, there were no concrete leads. The Sherri Papini case gradually became one of the most mysterious disappearance stories in California, keeping all of America on edge for several weeks. No one could predict the unexpected turn this story would take. After 22 days of intense searching, prayers, and sleepless nights, at 4:30 a.m. on November 24, 2016, Thanksgiving Day, something unexpected happened. A motorist driving along Interstate 5 near the city of Yuba near Sacramento, approximately 150 miles from Redding, noticed an exhausted woman waving her hands on the side of the road. This woman turned out to be Sherri Papini. When the police patrol arrived at the scene, they found Sherri in an extremely exhausted state. Her body was covered with numerous bruises and wounds, her weight had decreased to critical levels, and her long blonde hair had been cut. Most shocking was the discovery of burns in the form of a brand on her skin. Sherri was bound in chains, with only one free hand visible, which she had used to attract the attention of the driver on the road. Please subscribe to my channel, and I will bring you more videos featuring the most shocking true crime stories. Sherri was immediately taken to the nearest hospital, where medical professionals confirmed her poor physical condition. She had lost over 20 pounds during her absence, decreasing from her usual weight of 100 pounds to an extremely dangerous 87 pounds. Doctors found signs of torture all over her body, indicating severe mistreatment. Sherri's emotional state was no less concerning. She was in a state of severe stress and shock. The reunion with her family was emotional and moving. Keith Papini described the moment when he told his children that their mom had returned as the happiest day of his life. "Tyler and Violet were just beaming with joy," he said. "They didn't understand where their mom had been all this time, but they're just happy that she's with us again." When Sherri recovered enough to give testimony, she told a shocking story about her abduction. According to her, during her morning jog, she was stopped by a car from which two Hispanic-looking women emerged, armed with a gun. They allegedly forced her into the car, covered her face with a bag, and took her to an unknown location, which Sherri described as a small house or garage. During the 3 weeks of captivity, according to Sherri, she was kept in a locked room, regularly subjected to physical violence, restricted in food, had her hair cut, and was branded on her skin. She claimed that she was constantly kept in handcuffs or chains, sometimes blindfolded. Sherri could not clearly determine the location of her imprisonment, but said she heard Spanish spoken and provided a very detailed description of her kidnappers: one, older, with gray hair and a heavy build; the other, younger, thin, with dark eyes. The most intriguing part of Sherri's account was her release. According to her, the kidnappers suddenly decided to release her, dropping her off on the side of the road. She could not explain the reason for this decision, only noting that she heard an argument between the women before her release. Sherri said that one of the women let her out of the car and drove away. This dramatic story shocked all of America. Sherri Papini became a symbol of resilience and miracle, and her return to her family, a story of hope that was broadcast on all national channels. However, investigators, despite the joy of finding Sherri alive, had many questions about the circumstances of her disappearance and return. After Sherri Papini's emotional return, the investigation entered a new, more complex phase. The Shasta County Sheriff's Office, together with the FBI, continued the investigation, now focusing on finding the two Hispanic female kidnappers. Based on Sherri's testimony, police sketches of the probable criminals were created and widely distributed by media across the country. Investigators worked tirelessly, checking every detail of Sherri's story. They analyzed hundreds of hours of surveillance camera footage along routes the kidnappers might have taken, interviewed dozens of potential witnesses, and checked numerous reports from citizens. Law enforcement also searched for the house or garage where Sherri might have been held, especially focusing on areas with Spanish-speaking populations, as Sherri claimed she heard her kidnappers speaking Spanish. Keith Papini was a passionate defender of his wife. In interviews, he detailed Sherri's injuries and her difficult path to recovery. According to him, Sherri often woke up from nightmares, jumped at loud noises, and was afraid to be alone. "She's not the strong, independent woman she was before," Keith said in an interview with ABC News. "Our children see that something is wrong with their mother. She tries to be strong for them, but the pain and fear are still with her." The Papini family even temporarily moved from Mountain Gate to Keith's parents' house to avoid increased media attention and provide Sherri with a peaceful environment for recovery. Meanwhile, public support for Sherri was extraordinary. A GoFundMe fundraiser created for the search collected over $49,000 for medical expenses and recovery. Local residents brought food, wrote letters of support, and offered all kinds of help to the Papini family. Sherri's story resonated with many Americans, especially women, who saw in her a symbol of survival and resilience. However, despite all the efforts of investigative agencies, the case progressed slowly. Neither the car used by the kidnappers, nor the house where Sherri was kept, nor any physical evidence that could point to the identity of the criminals was found. This began to raise certain questions among both law enforcement and investigative journalists. Some aspects of Sherri's story seemed strange. For example, her kidnappers supposedly took careful measures not to leave any DNA traces on her body or clothes, which is unusual for a random abduction during a morning jog. It also raised questions as to why the women suddenly decided to release Sherri after 3 weeks of detention and torture, without making any ransom demands. Over time, investigators began to dig deeper, examining Sherri's past, her social connections, and possible motives for fabricating the kidnapping. It was discovered that before her marriage to Keith, Sherri had been briefly married to another man. Phone records, emails, and social media activity were analyzed. Gradually, new details emerged that caused investigators to question the version presented by Sherri. One of the key elements of the investigation was the analysis of DNA found on Sherri's clothing on the day of her return. Despite Sherri's assertion that there were no men among her kidnappers, traces of male DNA were found on her clothing. This became the first serious inconsistency in her story that investigators could not ignore. The Sherri Papini case continued to remain in the public eye, generating more questions than answers. Investigators, however, did not give up hope of finding the truth, methodically working on every detail of this complicated story. The investigation into Sherri Papini's case continued for years, gradually revealing more inconsistencies in her testimony. Investigators worked patiently and methodically, gathering evidence that eventually disproved the kidnapping story. The key moment in uncovering the truth was the male DNA found on Sherri's clothing. In 2020, 4 years after the incident, investigators finally got a result: the DNA belonged to Sherri's ex-boyfriend. Detectives tracked this man to Costa Mesa in Southern California, and during questioning, he made a stunning confession. According to him, Sherri herself had planned her disappearance and asked him to help her escape from her family life. It turned out that this man, later identified as James Reyes, had a romantic relationship with Sherri before her marriage to Keith. They reconnected through correspondence and phone calls in 2016 when Sherri's marriage was going through difficult times. Reyes confirmed that Sherri voluntarily stayed in his apartment during the 22 days of her kidnapping. According to him, he was not even aware of the large-scale search, as he did not follow the news. Moreover, the man stated that Sherri inflicted most of the injuries on herself to make her story look credible, and some injuries he inflicted at her request. "She asked me to hit her to leave bruises," Reyes testified. "I initially refused, but she insisted, saying it was necessary for her plan." This interrogation revealed the shocking truth: there were no Hispanic female kidnappers, no forced captivity. The story that captivated all of America turned out to be a carefully planned hoax. Investigators also discovered that before staging the kidnapping, Sherri had been communicating with her ex-boyfriend using hidden phones and specially created email addresses. Concurrently, financial experts found that Sherri had received significant funds from the California Victim Compensation Board, over $30,000. This money was used to pay for therapy sessions, installing a home security system, and other expenses related to her trauma. Added to this sum was nearly $49,000 collected through GoFundMe to support the family during the crisis, which Sherri and Keith used to pay off credit cards and other debts. Particularly shocking was the fact that Sherri deliberately created the image of Hispanic kidnappers, adding a racial aspect to her false story. She described her non-existent kidnappers in detail, their accent, appearance, even how they argued in Spanish. This generated considerable fear and suspicion in California's Hispanic community, whose members could have become objects of undeserved suspicion and discrimination. Having gathered sufficient evidence, in March 2022, almost 5.5 years after the staged kidnapping, federal agents arrested Sherri Papini. She was charged with mail fraud and making false statements to federal agents, crimes punishable by up to 25 years in prison. Sherri's arrest was a shock to everyone who had followed her story, especially those who believed her account and supported her throughout all these years. Keith Papini, who had always defended his wife, learned the truth only on the eve of her arrest when investigators revealed to him the real circumstances of Sherri's disappearance. According to neighbors, Keith was devastated, feeling deceived not only as a husband but also as the father of their children who had to endure this trauma. After Sherri Papini's arrest and the charges of mail fraud and making false statements to federal agents, the case finally began moving toward its logical conclusion. Initially, Sherri did not admit her guilt, insisting on the truth of her kidnapping story. However, faced with substantial evidence, including her ex-boyfriend's testimony in DNA test results, on April 13, 2022, she changed her position. In a Sacramento court, Sherri Papini officially pleaded guilty to 2 counts. "I am deeply ashamed of my behavior and sorry for the pain I've caused my family, my friends, all the good people who needlessly suffered because of my story, and those who worked to try to help me," she stated in a written statement released through her attorney. The guilty plea marked the beginning of the Papini family's dissolution. A few days later, Keith filed for divorce, stating that he could no longer trust Sherri after everything that had happened. He also filed for full custody of their children, by then 9-year-old Tyler and 7-year-old Violet. In court documents, Keith noted that the children were devastated by the news of their mother's deception, and that he was trying to protect them from further trauma. Keith's parents, who had actively supported Sherri during her disappearance, also felt betrayed. They openly expressed their disappointment and shock at how their daughter-in-law had deceived the entire family for such a long time. Meanwhile, Sherri's parents, Loretta and Richard Grafe, maintained silence, refusing to comment on the situation. On September 19, 2022, the sentencing hearing took place. Before the court, Sherri Papini delivered an emotional speech in which she admitted suffering from serious emotional problems. "I am so bad," she sobbed. "I am ashamed of what I did. I am so grateful for your mercy." Prosecutors demanded 8 months imprisonment for Sherri Papini, arguing that her actions had caused significant harm to the community, law enforcement, and victims of real crimes. The defendants' deception was deliberate, well-planned, and long-standing, they stated in their filing. They also emphasized the racial aspect of the false kidnapping, noting that Sherri fabricated the image of cruel Hispanic women, creating a stereotype that could cause further discrimination. The judge, having considered all the circumstances of the case, sentenced Sherri Papini to 18 months in federal prison, which was significantly longer than prosecutors had recommended. Additionally, the court ordered her to pay restitution of over $300,000, this included investigation costs, funds received from the California Victim Compensation Board, and money collected through GoFundMe. During the sentencing, Judge William Shub characterized Sherri's actions as a nonsensical fantasy, and noted that she had continued to deceive law enforcement even after being given numerous opportunities to confess the truth. "People don't know why you did what you did," he said. "And I think you still don't quite know why." Sherri Papini's conviction put an end to a long saga that had kept all of America on edge for almost 6 years. The story of a young mother who staged her own kidnapping to escape the reality of her life became a vivid example of how personal problems and an inability to cope with them can lead to catastrophic consequences not only for an individual but also for her loved ones, the community, and society as a whole. After her sentencing in September 2022, Sherri Papini was imprisoned at the Federal Women's Prison in Dublin, California. Her rapid fall from the position of perfect mother to convicted fraudster became the subject of numerous documentaries and podcasts. Keith Papini, having gained full custody of the children after a quick divorce, focused on protecting them from the media. In an interview with ABC News, he described the difficult process of explaining their mother's lies to the children and the need for psychological therapy for the entire family. Eventually, they left Redding to start a new life. Unexpectedly, in July 2023, after serving only half of her term, Sherri was transferred to a transitional facility in Sacramento. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, such a reduction in security is assigned to inmates with good behavior. At this facility, she had the opportunity to work and participate in rehabilitation programs, actively addressing her mental health. In March 2024, Sherri Papini was fully released. According to local media, she remained in the Sacramento area, finding employment in the service industry. She continues to pay her court debt of over $300,000 according to the established schedule. Meanwhile, Keith began a new relationship and focused on raising the children. "We're trying not to focus on the past, but look forward," he shared with ABC News. Public attitudes toward Sherri remain ambivalent. Some believe she deserves forgiveness in light of her psychological problems, while others still feel anger over the deception. Her false accusations against Hispanic women caused particular resonance and, according to CNN, drew attention to the issue of racial prejudice. In February 2024, Peacock released a documentary series in which Sherri publicly explained her actions for the first time as a consequence of childhood trauma and an inability to cope with the pressure of being perfect. And in March, after her full release, she gave an interview to the Reading Record Searchlight. "I know I can never fully repair the damage I've caused, but I strive to live honestly and perhaps rebuild relationships with my children." Today, in early 2025, the Papini case has become an important lesson for law enforcement regarding the thorough verification of testimony even in emotionally compelling cases. For psychologists, it is valuable material for studying the motivation behind such falsifications. The Reading community, once united in supporting Sherri, now seeks to leave this story in the past. As one local resident noted, "We were all deceived, but life goes on. I hope she finds peace with herself, and her children can grow up without the shadow of this story."
If you enjoy deep dives into true crime, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Until next time, friends!